A bag of fertilizer doesn't look like power. It doesn't carry a flag. It doesn't make headlines. And it never appears in speeches about national security. Yet for modern civilization, it may be one of the most powerful objects on Earth. Over the last few years, fertilizer prices didn't just rise. In many countries, they exploded fast enough to rewrite food budgets, government subsidies, and even political outcomes. How did we end up in a world where 3 chemical inputs can shape inflation, interest rates, and social stability across continents? Who benefits when fertilizer becomes scarce, and who pays the price? Because when farmers use less fertilizer, the crisis doesn't stay on the farm. It travels straight into grocery stores, household budgets, and eventually the streets. To understand why fertilizer matters so much, you have to step back from today's inflation charts and look at how the modern world learned to feed itself. For most of human history, agriculture was constrained by soil nutrients. Yields were low, harvests were fragile, and famine was a recurring feature of life. That changed dramatically in the 20th century, when chemistry merged with farming. The Haber-Bosch process made it possible to turn atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia at industrial scale. Phosphate mining expanded. Potash deposits were developed. Together, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium became the invisible backbone of the global food system. By some estimates, nearly half of the calories consumed by humans today depend on synthetic fertilizer. Without it, the planet could not support 8 billion people. This chemical foundation of food also created a hidden dependency. Fertilizer is not just another agricultural input. It is energy-intensive, capital-heavy, and geographically concentrated. Nitrogen fertilizer depends heavily on natural gas. Phosphorus comes from a limited number of phosphate rock deposits. Potash is extracted from deep underground mines that take years, sometimes decades, to develop. This means supply cannot respond quickly to shocks. When something goes wrong, prices do not adjust smoothly. They jump. For years, this fragility remained mostly invisible to consumers. Fertilizer markets were volatile, but food systems absorbed the shocks. That changed when energy prices surged, geopolitics hardened, and trade became a weapon. As natural gas prices spiked, the cost of producing ammonia soared. Fertilizer plants in some regions shut down because operating them no longer made economic sense. At the same time, several major exporting countries began to restrict fertilizer shipments, prioritizing domestic food security over global supply. What looked like isolated policy decisions quickly added up to a global squeeze. The mechanics are brutal in their simplicity. Fertilizer prices rise. Farmers face higher input costs. Large agribusinesses may hedge or pass costs forward, but small and medium farmers often cannot. Many reduce fertilizer use. Lower fertilizer application leads to lower yields. Lower yields tighten food supply. Food prices rise. Inflation accelerates. Governments intervene with subsidies or price controls. Budgets strain. Political tensions rise. What begins as a chemical shortage ends as a social problem. The energy link makes this chain even more volatile. Nitrogen fertilizer is, in effect, solidified natural gas. When gas prices double or triple, fertilizer costs follow. This ties food security directly to energy markets and, by extension, to geopolitics. Conflicts that disrupt gas flows ripple into agriculture. Sanctions meant to pressure governments reshape fertilizer trade. Shipping disruptions delay deliveries just long enough to miss planting seasons. Timing matters. In agriculture, a missed window cannot be recovered with money later. This is where geography becomes destiny. Fertilizer production is concentrated in a handful of countries and regions. A small number of exporters dominate nitrogen, phosphate, and potash markets. When these exporters impose restrictions or face internal disruptions, import-dependent countries feel the shock immediately. Many developing nations rely almost entirely on imports for fertilizer. They do not have the fiscal capacity to subsidize farmers at scale. When prices surge, farmers simply use less. The result is not just higher prices, but lower food availability. The effects are uneven. Wealthier countries can cushion the blow. Governments step in with subsidies. Credit systems extend payment terms. Strategic reserves are released. In poorer regions, the margin for error is thin. Fertilizer becomes unaffordable. Yields fall. Food imports rise just as global prices increase. Currencies weaken. The spiral tightens. History offers uncomfortable parallels. Food price spikes have long been catalysts for unrest. Bread riots are not a metaphor. They are a recurring feature of societies under stress. When basic staples become expensive or scarce, political legitimacy erodes. Today's fertilizer shock feeds into that historical pattern, but with modern complexity layered on top. Inflation targets, interest rates, and bond markets now react to food prices. Central banks tighten policy to fight inflation, driven partly by agricultural inputs. Higher rates slow economies. Households feel squeezed from multiple directions at once. There's also a quieter transformation happening in rural areas. Farmers are forced to make trade-offs that affect long-term productivity. Skipping fertilizer may save cash in the short term, but it can degrade soil health over time. This sets up a future of lower yields, even if prices normalize. The crisis thus plants the seeds of the next one. International comparisons reveal how differently systems absorb the same shock. In some countries, fertilizer subsidies are treated as national security spending. Governments accept higher deficits to stabilize food production. Elsewhere, market pricing prevails, and farmers bear the cost. These choices reflect deeper political and fiscal structures. They also shape social outcomes. Where support exists, production holds. Where it doesn't, scarcity grows. The geopolitical implications are profound. Fertilizer becomes leverage. Exporters gain influence. Importers scramble for bilateral deals. Food aid becomes more expensive and less available. The global system fragments into protected blocks. Efficiency gives way to resilience, but at a cost. Redundant supply chains are safer, but more expensive. Those costs flow downstream. Technology offers partial answers, but no miracles. More efficient fertilizer use can reduce demand. Precision agriculture can optimize application. Recycling nutrients from waste streams can supplement supply. Green ammonia promises lower emissions, but not lower costs in the near term. These solutions require investment, infrastructure, and time. None can replace existing systems overnight. Policy choices matter enormously. Strategic reserves of fertilizer can smooth shocks. Transparent trade rules reduce panic restrictions. Coordinated energy policy stabilizes production costs. Yet political incentives often push in the opposite direction. Leaders respond to domestic pressure, not global efficiency. Short-term stability at home can mean long-term instability abroad. The deeper lesson is uncomfortable. Modern civilization runs on systems that appear robust until they are stressed. Fertilizer sits at the intersection of energy, trade, agriculture, and politics. It reveals how interconnected the global economy really is. A disruption in one sector cascades through others in ways that are hard to predict and even harder to control. Looking forward, several paths are possible. In a best-case scenario, energy markets stabilize, fertilizer production expands, and prices normalize. Governments learn from the shock and invest in resilience. In a darker scenario, fragmentation deepens, trade barriers harden, climate stress adds volatility, fertilizer shortages become recurrent, not exceptional. Food insecurity rises, and with it, political instability. Most likely, the future lies somewhere in between, messy, uneven, and shaped by policy choices made under pressure. At its core, the fertilizer crisis is not just about chemistry or farming. It is about how societies manage dependence. It forces a reckoning with the true cost of feeding the world. Cheap food was never free. It was subsidized by energy, by geology, and by a fragile web of global cooperation. As that web phrase, the bill comes due. The story of fertilizer reminds us that the most important forces shaping our lives are often invisible. They sit far from city centers, deep underground, or behind industrial walls. Yet when they fail, the effects are unmistakable. Higher prices, tighter budgets, angrier politics, and a growing sense that the systems we rely on are less stable than we once believed. In the end, the question is not whether fertilizer will matter in the future. It already does. The real question is whether governments, markets, and societies can adapt fast enough to prevent a chemical bottleneck from becoming a permanent feature of the global economy. Because the next time fertilizer prices spike, the consequences may not be confined to balance sheets and harvest reports. They may define the political and social landscape of an entire decade. There is one more layer to this crisis that rarely shows up in price charts or policy debates, yet it may be the most destabilizing of all: time. Fertilizer shocks do not behave like oil shocks or financial crashes. You cannot simply inject liquidity, release strategic reserves, or wait for markets to rebalance next quarter. Agriculture operates on biological calendars. Crops grow or fail on fixed schedules. When fertilizer arrives late or not at all, the damage is locked in for an entire season. By the time the consequences appear in food prices, the decision that caused them was made months earlier, quietly, on a farm far from financial centers. This time, lag creates a dangerous illusion. In the early phase of a fertilizer shock, the system appears stable, supermarket shelves remain full, governments reassure the public, inflation data moves slowly. But beneath the surface, farmers are already making irreversible choices. They switch to lower yield crops. They reduce application rates. They leave marginal land fallow. Each decision looks rational in isolation. Together, they reshape the food supply months down the line when it is too late to intervene. This delayed effect also distorts political accountability. When food prices surge, governments blame weather, speculators, or global conditions. Rarely do they trace the problem back to fertilizer affordability during planting season. The causal chain is long, technical, and invisible to voters. That makes it easier for short-term policies to dominate. Export restrictions feel decisive. Subsidies feel generous, but neither addresses the structural vulnerability that caused the shock in the first place. The human consequences of this delay are most visible in places where households spend a large share of income on food. In these regions, even small price increases can push families into crisis. Parents skip meals, children leave school, health outcomes worsen. These are not abstract outcomes. They are measurable, predictable, and historically linked to food price volatility. Yet they are often treated as unfortunate side effects rather than core indicators of system failure. At the same time, fertilizer scarcity changes behavior in global markets in subtle ways. Traders price in uncertainty. Importers rush to secure supply, bidding prices higher. Governments hoard, fearing future shortages. Each action is rational from a national perspective. Collectively, they amplify volatility. What began as a production constraint becomes a confidence problem. Markets stop asking how much fertilizer exists and start asking who will get it. This is where fertilizer quietly intersects with geopolitics in its most consequential form. Control over inputs becomes control over outcomes. Countries with domestic production gain leverage. Those without become vulnerable, not just economically, but politically. Food security turns into a bargaining chip. Aid becomes conditional. Trade becomes transactional in new ways. The global system shifts from cooperation to competition, not because leaders desire conflict, but because scarcity leaves them little room to maneuver. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the fertilizer crisis is how familiar it feels. The patterns echo past resource shocks: energy, water, even housing. Concentration, underinvestment in resilience, over-reliance on efficiency. And then suddenly, a shock that reveals how thin the margins really were. Fertilizer simply exposes this dynamic in one of the most sensitive domains imaginable: food. In that sense, fertilizer is not just a commodity. It is a mirror. It reflects the priorities of the global economy. For decades, the goal was maximum output at minimum cost. Redundancy was waste. Stockpiles were inefficient. Supply chains were optimized to the edge. That logic worked until it didn't. But when conditions changed, there was no buffer, only reaction. The uncomfortable truth is that feeding the world sustainably may require accepting higher costs, slower efficiency gains, and more political coordination than societies are currently willing to tolerate. It means treating fertilizer not as a background input, but as strategic infrastructure. It means recognizing that stability has a price, and that ignoring that price only defers payment to the most vulnerable. By the time fertilizer scarcity shows up as empty shelves or public unrest, the real decisions are already behind us. The crisis has already happened. What remains is its aftermath, and whether that aftermath becomes a temporary shock or a recurring feature of global life depends less on chemistry than on choices, about cooperation, investment, and the kind of economic system we are willing to sustain.